We just didn't know that there was another.
Also, not to be this person, but you guys closed yourself off from the fucking world. How are we supposed to know that the leading scientists are in the public? Guys, if you would have shared this stuff earlier, maybe we would have been coming first. We had to use Bruce Banner, who can't even get his powers.
You're already annoying.
That
We
bitch is
actually
annoying as
tripled
fuck.
our sales revenue from Google Ads when we incorporated Performance Max. So Google Ads allowed us to find that audience at scale and build awareness with people who were ready to make a change. Watch this. I'm going to launch a business in 60 seconds using Shopify's AI Sidekick. No coding, no design skills, just a conversation. Timer starts now. So I'm starting a skincare line in a store that looks clean, modern, premium. I'm just going to tell Sidekick that. See, layout, the whole look, done. No coding required. Sidekick just built it from a sentence. Now I need to add my products, but I only have phone fix on my bathroom counter. Guess what? Place this on a marble countertop with soft, natural light.
Basically, everything seems like it's going to work out in the end. Alright, let's watch. In this film, we get to see the X-Men at the height of their powers. The teenagers from before don't act like teenagers. They get by far better looking awful great. Oh no, people should have. The teenagers don't have any nuance or level of intrigue of the previous two. They're basically ripped right from the CW. You can see this kind of bourbon and his character for the 15 minutes that he's in the Philhouse Green. Cyclops is probably the first form of character assassination when it comes to main characters in a superhero movie. Sure, there's been some badly adapted characters and villains, but truly, I don't think there's ever been a worse superhero. Cyclops is far worse than this one. He was an awful character in the first movie as well. Bunch of flat we don't ever get to see him interact with the kids. Even around the adults, he doesn't have any kind of banter or really anything that sets him apart from anybody else. This is not Cyclops. This is a weird shell of a character that has all these problems going on. When they inevitably make the X-Men part of the MCU, I really hope that's much better than this. Because even though he gets better in Fox's X-Men universe, it's not really. It's also worth mentioning that Mystique does absolutely nothing in this movie. She's on the same level as Cyclops, except in the previous movie, Mystique actually had some interesting character development. Even Xavier dies, and I think that they did these things to some of these major characters to make room for new characters like Kitty Pryde, Juggernaut, Beast, Arcade, and they are really given their proper time to shine. They use their powers in some cool action scenes, but nowhere near as interesting as the previous two movies. Rogue, who was once hardly a protagonist, was introduced to a bitter and was able to become an actual X-Man. I feel like they just had no idea how to utilize her power, so instead they forced her on a triangle and made her want to get the cure. This movie had no idea how to handle any existing characters, and no idea how to so this movie has to do well. So they don't really mix well together at all. There's this cure for mutants and inside is an mutants pod, and then there's the Dark Phoenix plotline for genes that X-Men have to take care of. What do these plotlines have to do with one another? Basically, nothing at all. Maybe it's supposed to show that some mutants are so powerful that they should take this cure, but that message doesn't really seem that great when you compare it to the first two. The first two films were about misunderstood people and how we, as a society, should be afraid of them. But the message of this film is, weird people that we don't understand, we need to get rid of them. This film does still unintentionally have a lot of modern flaws, and some people being all for this cure, and some people saying, no way, not. But other than that, the message is really conflicted and kind of toned down before the first one was trying to say. I will say that Robert Johnson's portrayal of Jane in this movie is pretty great. They might have not written the storyline very well at all, but the performance is fantastic. You can see the moments that it really Jane comes on and making the movies comes through, and the moments that it's the Phoenix. The distinction in her performance is really great, and honestly one of the highlights of this movie. Magneto isn't even that great. He's more of your classic movie villain that you sympathize with and see his point of view. He has a few great moments talking about Charles' death. He still found a friend that respected him, even trying to stop Jean from killing him, but that's about it. Logan being the one to take out Jean is emotional. Kinda. I never really felt their chemistry or romance at all. Logan had like a crush on her in the first two movies, but it was never like she was trying to decide between Scott or Logan. It was always that she was Scott and Wolverine was just the It's not really a this movie issue, more of a some of the action scenes are cool. The final battle feels cartoons. The pacing is pretty good, even if the story we're seeing isn't. And the final scene of the movie, with Magneto having a hint of his powers coming back, is a truly fantastic scene to end on. This is a fun summer blockbuster, but it's nowhere near on the level of the first two. The script isn't as smart, the nuances and the better characterizations are missing, and CGI is actually far worse in this one than it was in the previous two. There's a lot more fight scenes and grand events that utilize CGI, and in this one, it's pretty noticeable how old this film is. In the end, maybe the real X-Men The Last Stand are the X-Friends that we met along the way. Weird movie plagued by production issues, but still fun in a few moments. 6 out of 10.
Opiate dependency is a disease that can be cured.
The AMR procedure will reverse the roots of the problem and will allow human beings to enjoy the benefit of being a human being. There's hope. If you're watching, there's hope.
So this movie sounds pretty good on paper, right? We got a few answers during the trilogy, but a lot of Logan's backstory is still largely unknown. In X-Men 2, Stryker gives some vague exposition about the work they did together, and it sounded pretty cool. Watching a movie giving us all those answers should be really intriguing, right? Unfortunately not. This movie reduces Wolverine to the lowest common denominator. The CGI is worse than it was even back in the first X-Men. It raises a lot more questions than answers when it comes to it features characters to the point that even Fox was poking fun at it in the future, and I don't really want to waste any more of my time or your time talking about this movie. The best thing about this movie is nothing itself, and that's the movie tie-in game. When a movie tie-in game, which are usually awful, is the best thing about your movie, you know you've gone wrong somewhere along the way. Very bad. So there's been two not so great movies in a row. We really need a good one here if this franchise has any kind of future whatsoever. What's that? It's the prequel. Very good Ben Pringles. They're recasting Professor X and Magneto. This is not sounding good at all. Kevin Bacon is the bad guy. It sounds right. This is not the assassin. I didn't actually have these opinions when the movie was first coming out back in 2011. I was no calling for more X-Men at that time, but I was movies coming out now, and probably have all of these opinions. I've made it pretty clear that I'm not a fan of prequels on this channel, and my love for having story balance. So recasting them is just mind-blowing to me, but none of these worries are actually even remotely warranted for this film. In First Class, we get to see the background and history of Eric Mentor and Charles Xavier. We were told that they were once really great friends and initially were screwed together, but we didn't see them. We didn't see them recruit the first week of season why Charles is in a wheelchair or anything of that sort. He answers all of those questions to an incredibly satisfying conclusion. First off, James McAvoy and Iron Fassbender are magnificent as Charles and Eric. It seemed like such an impossible task. They characters, but they also really killed these roles. You can see hints of both Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen in their performances and their friends. works just as well as the older actors does. This movie is directed by Matthew Vaughn, the guy who was running to make X-Men The Last Stand. Fortunately, he had to back out of that movie, but if it meant that he had to back out of that film in order to make this one, then I'm completely fine with that. First Class takes what worked in the first two films of this franchise, dials it to 10, adds in some new and unique elements with a fresh voice as director, and delivers either the best or second best X-Men movie that had been made up to this point. Seeing Charles and Eric hone their skills while recruiting mutants, acting like they're young men, going to bars and having fun, and starting the X-Men was an absolute joy to see on screen. You also start to see their differences in the early until that hits a peak during the film's climax. We get all of the answers to the questions. How did they split up? How did Charles end up in a wheelchair? How did the Academy actually start? And then Magneto Stone left the turn. All this stuff doesn't actually line up. Magneto gets his helmet that blocks out Charles' thoughts. He barks about it, but years later in the first X-Men movie, Charles doesn't bother to fight his thoughts. In the beginning of X-Men The Last Stand, Charles and Eric look this while going to recruit Jean, but they're split up at the end of this movie, and Jean isn't even in this one. That's when the Army starting to form, but I suppose I can see past these problems. You know, they work in the context of this movie. They work in the context of this movie, but not in others. Let's talk Mystique. One of the stranger things we learned from this film is how good of friends Charles and Raven were since the beginning. There's no mention of this during the trilogy. I'm not sure if they ever even share any lines together, which is odd because how close they are during this film. Mystique was played by Jennifer Lawrence in this film, and in 2011, Jennifer Lawrence was really just starting to become famous. This was a year before the games, and unfortunately won an Oscar for Silver Linings Playbook, so while Mystique has a big role, it's nowhere near as big as it would be, but this film delivered everything that it needed to, and while this has been with all the recastings, as well as making people excited about the X-Men again after it's done so well received. It was also the first movie that mostly didn't feature Wolverine, and that was also quite a big statement. A lot of people call this their favorite X-Men film. Don't really blame you if you do. In some ways, this is the most X-Men out of all the X-Men movies, if that makes any sense. For me, I still prefer X2, but this film is one of the decent so far, so 8.5 out of 10. Well, the good news is that the movie has heavily more of a character study on Wolverine, and how he's living with the trauma of killing Jean Grey, and more of his past history is explained. I only ever watched this once, and again, it's also special the first time around. I was more or less right this time around. Yeah, starting off with a flashback of the atomic bomb. This guy contacts Logan and wants his movie. This does the scenes, the love we have, and this is a lot to make fun of. The most interesting part of this film is the ending scene. You see Logan, and Native has his power, and he's also Charles Xavier. We all we see a commercial version. Mysteries on the TV. This film is kind of hit or miss. If you like the Logan Samurai content, then it will a lot. This does go back and touch on some of Logan's comic origins as well, but this movie is largely confused. Sure, Wolverine is a great character, and action scenes, but the movie isn't essential to understand the character or really anything else going forward. Like I said, it's pretty hit or miss. Me, it's nice for me, but I still don't think it's not really my cup of tea. You don't really see the point of it. Saying X-Men class and Days of Future Past dialed that to 11 because this movie was by far the most ambitious film in the franchise, and to this day, there really isn't any other superhero movie like this one. This movie was a sequel to two different franchises, the one that ended on a not so high note, and a movie that basically the first one. They made a sequel. Well, you bring back the original cast, take the higher shocking turn to X that quite literally changes the franchise. Mix that all together, and you have, prepare yourself here, what I think to be the greatest superhero movie ever. A shocking statement, I know. It's not as good as things like The Dark Knight, but in terms of the greatest of the great MCU movies, anything else out there, I think that Days of Future Past stands as my personal favorite superhero. Yeah, I said it. Do I have an extreme bias towards X-Men? Yes, I do. Does that influence my decision on calling this the best superhero movie of all time? Of course it does. I said it. So let me tell you, Days of Future Past shows us the world years after X-Men last stand. It's dark, post-apocalyptic. It shows that even the X-Men at full strength and the other team still can't beat the Sentinels. There seems to be no hope, and then the opening credits hit us with that same intro music as X-Men 2, and you know you're in for a good time. This opening fight against the Sentinels shows us some returning characters and new ones, all using their powers in unique ways, and how the Sentinels just turn around and use them against some of the other X-Men. One of these unique powers is how Kitty Pryde can now send somebody back in time. This sets up a plan to send Wolverine back in time and stop the Sentinels from ever being made in the first place. In order to do this, they have to stop Mystique from killing Tyrion Lannister, Oliver Trask. What I find very funny is how this future is a continuation of the last trilogy, but there's very little mention of the Last Stand throughout the entire movie. Sure, there's Bobby and Kitty who are now together, even though he ended the trilogy with Rogue, but there's very little mention of Jean or Cyclops, why Professor X is now alive, or how Magneto has his powers. Hell, even how Wolverine has his metal claws back isn't mentioned. You can infer a lot of these things and kind of connect the dots yourself for sure, or you can just look past it because it's all necessary for this story to actually work. But right when Logan is sent back in time, the mood of the film completely changes. The contrast of the 70s to the future is immense and makes for some comedic moments throughout the entire runtime.
You want to say something? Somebody gave you really bad message. Yeah.
Logan talking to the younger Charles and Hank and telling them about the future sounds insane, and with a broken and disheveled Charles, it makes you realize just how much Wolverine has changed across all of his films, that now he has to be the mentor to Charles, when it was the other way around all those years ago. In a lot of ways, this film is a return to form to the X2 days. Some of the strengths that that movie had, this movie has too, like introducing new characters. So let's talk about Quicksilver. One of the more memorable moments from this film and about this new trilogy in general is the character of Quicksilver. Now, something I do remember at the time this film was being made was that Quicksilver was going to be in this film, but also in Avengers Age of Ultron. Something about the rights of the character being shared. Who cares? But I remember everybody was saying that they have no clue why this movie was going to use Quicksilver when the MCU was just so obviously going to make the character better. Well, everybody ate their words because even if you don't agree this is the best comic book movie ever made, I do. I think everybody can agree that Quicksilver was not a in this film, far better than the MCU version. Both MCU versions. The scenes with the younger Charles and Eric proved to be just as compelling as the scenes with the older Charles and Eric, which just proves how well cast these characters were. With all four of them in the same film, they could have easily been overshadowed by the legacy actors, but they aren't, and this is one of the aspects that really works in this film. Seeing the younger versions bicker and fight is essentially their friendship at this point, and the younger work together. Makes you see just how far these two characters have come and go. The story of being friends is far more tragic than anything else. A lot of the bigger moments of tension
UAV recon standing by. UAV is online.
They succeed only for Magneto to try and take matters into his own hands by killing her, which would stop the future from happening, but only on his terms. Logan can't stop him because who's there to shake him to his core but William Stryker. These moments, while obviously convenient, all flow together to make a cohesive story. Perhaps the best scene in this film is when the younger Charles looks into Logan's mind and sees the future, having a conversation with his older self. Having a scene with both versions of this character almost borders on like fan service, but it also absolutely works for the story. The younger Charles needed to have this conversation in order to fully believe in himself and carry out to his plan. This movie is filled with moments like this too. I mentioned back in the first class portion that Mystique will continue to have a bigger role going forward, and that's on full display in this film.
Are UAV is online?
Is the choice of Mystique. In the end, when Mystique has the choice to kill Frank, Even B is really the scene that makes the movie work. Essentially, she can pull the trigger, and the rest of the movies will play out exactly as they have. The series will essentially be complete, or she can not pull the trigger, and the entire history of events will change. I remember watching this scene for the first time in years, fully realizing these ramifications and really wondering what they were going to do here. In some ways, it makes more sense for her to just pull the trigger so that way the rest of the movies can carry on the way that they did. But if she didn't pull the trigger, then this whole universe changes. Ultimately, she does pull the trigger, and the entire X-Men universe as we know it is changed. Ending this storyline, Mystique is obviously due to the fact that she's being played by Jennifer Lawrence. She was at an all-time high in fame and popularity at this point, but the plot is forced, just giving her more screen time than she deserves. They crafted the story around her performance, and that's what makes it work. Wolverine has obviously been the selling point of this franchise, so set it back in time because it's a unit trip. It also makes sense as they build the story around him being saved. I also like that it's not Wolverine who saved the day at the end. All seems lost in the future timeline, especially when Wolverine gets dumped into the lake by Magneto, and it's really up to Charles and Mystique. There's such a hopeless feeling towards the end, and it's what makes the twist that changes everything. In the end, it seems that everything is fixed, and the events of the first trilogy never actually happened anymore. There are two different versions of this movie. There's the theatrical version and the road cut. The road cut adds a few scenes, but ultimately isn't that different from the theatrical version. The main changes are essentially that Rogue has to take over for Kitty after she gets injured, giving her something to do as an X-Man. One of my main issues with The Last Stand, so I like that there's some redemption there for her character. There's also an extra scene with the older Magneto in the mansion in order to get Rogue. And this is a scene that I actually really like, despite there not really being any setup. It gives some extra time with the future versions of the characters. This movie is already split like 70-30 in favor of the past timeline, so whenever I watch a version of this movie, it's usually the road. While yes, I do prefer this. There are some issues with all series that has a really fantastic villain. Oliver Trask seems pretty underutilized. I think there's some hints of a great character in there, but with how much this movie already had to do, I think Oliver Trask was clearly not very high up on the priority list. There are definitely some plot holes, and that just comes in the territory when telling a story like this, but why doesn't the future change when the mutants are first revealed in the past? Wouldn't that change like a ton of events in the timeline? Or when the Sentinels attack? Wouldn't they not trust Trask anymore to carry out this program? Is it because Wolverine hadn't come back to the future yet? The way all of this works isn't very clear. There is a line Hank has about the ripple effect. It make more sense that it would be much longer. The ending scene also doesn't make any sense at all. We see Stryker getting Wolverine, which would lead into the experiments, but it's not actually Stryker, it's Mystique. This doesn't actually end up leading anywhere, so it's odd that they put in this eye effect. If it didn't, the story would have actually made more sense. But overall, nuance and playing is not bad. This isn't an action set movie.
We're about to win this one. Get up the
It's
fire.
about social issues, about friendship, and the ability to change. X-Men has always dealt with social issues, and this one does it too, but it also takes it a step further. It also even has a subtle nod towards addiction and the war on drugs. I can look past a few of the issues this movie had because of how much it had to overcome. Being a sequel for two different movies at the same time and decide whether to change the entire franchise or make it come full circle. As you can probably expect with how much time I've spent talking about this movie,
UAV recon standing by. Are UAV is online?
Future Pass, A 10 out of 10.
Sell everywhere your customers are. And AI choice.
Mission accomplished. Good work, Marines.
So I'm not really going to spend too long on these because as they are just kind of footnote in this universe, at least for now. That might change depending on how the story goes, but as for now, these are funny, fourth wall breaking films about a small pocket in the X-Men universe. What's good in space? What's good in space? No one can hear you scream. But at the movie theater, everyone can hear you scream. Whether it's in the horror